John Anderson always thought he'd hit the jackpot when he bought his house. Nestled at the edge of a quiet, shimmering lake, it was the kind of place people dream about. The mornings were peaceful, with mist rising off the water and birds chirping in the trees. Evenings brought fiery sunsets that painted the sky orange and pink. For years, John lived in blissful solitude, enjoying everything nature had to offer right outside his back door. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few months ago, John got a letter in the mail informing him that his neighborhood had been absorbed into a larger homeowners association, or HOA, as most folks called it. At first, he didn't think much of it. He'd heard stories about strict HOAs, sure, but those seemed like isolated incidents. Surely, they wouldn't bother someone who just wanted to live quietly by the lake, right? Wrong. The HOA came with rules, lots of them. Rules about what color you could paint your front door, how tall your grass could grow, and even whether or not you could hang a flag on certain holidays. Most of these rules felt silly to John, but he figured he could deal with them if it meant keeping the peace. After all, the dues weren't too high, and the community did seem well maintained. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Then one hot summer afternoon, everything changed. It was one of those days where the air felt thick and sticky, and the only thing on John's mind was cooling off. So, he grabbed his towel, slipped into his swim trunks, and headed down to the lake behind his house. It wasn't exactly Olympic-sized, but it was perfect for floating around or doing a few lazy laps. As he waded into the water, he felt the stress of the day melt away. This was his little slice of heaven, and no one could take that from him, or so he thought. About 10 minutes later, as John was floating on his back staring up at the clouds, he heard footsteps crunching along the shore. Thinking it might be a neighbor stopping by to say hello, he turned his head and saw Karen. Now, if you've ever lived in a neighborhood within HOA, chances are you've met someone like Karen. She was the type of person who thrived on enforcing rules, and not in a friendly, helpful way either. No, Karen took her role very seriously, almost obsessively so. She wore khaki shorts, a polo shirt, and a visor that looked like it belonged on a tennis court. In one hand, she held a clipboard, in the other, a pen poised to jot down infractions. "Excuse me," Karen barked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the afternoon. "What do you think you're doing?" John blinked, momentarily confused. "Swimming," he replied, as though it should have been obvious. Karen pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed. "You can't just swim whenever you feel like it," she said, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "There are rules, you know." At this point, John sat up in the water, water dripping off his shoulders. "Rules? About swimming?" "Yes, rules," Karen snapped. Rule 472b clearly states that recreational use of shared bodies of water requires prior written approval from the HOA board. "Did you get permission before coming out here?" John stared at her, dumbfounded. Shared bodies of water? Written approval? This was his backyard, for crying out loud. Sure, the HOA technically owned part of the lake bed, but the shoreline belonged to him. Everyone knew that, or at least, they used to. Apparently, Karen had decided otherwise. "I didn't know I needed permission to swim in my own lake," John said slowly, trying to keep his tone calm despite the absurdity of the situation. "Well, now you do," Karen retorted, scribbling something on her clipboard. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she tore off a piece of paper and handed it to him. "Here's your fine. $1,000. Pay it within 30 days, or we'll tack on additional penalties." John looked down at the slip of paper in disbelief. $1,000 for swimming? It was ridiculous, laughable even. But as he glanced back up at Karen, he realized she wasn't joking. Her expression was stern, almost triumphant, as if issuing fines gave her some twisted sense of satisfaction. For a moment, John considered arguing. He wanted to tell her how insane this whole thing was, how she was overstepping her bounds and ruining what should have been a relaxing day. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the way she seemed utterly convinced she was in the right. Or maybe it was the sinking feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't going to end anytime soon. Instead, John nodded stiffly, folded the paper, and tucked it into his pocket. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll take care of it." As Karen marched away, clipboard in hand, John climbed out of the lake and dried himself off. His mood had shifted completely. What had started as a carefree afternoon had turned into something else entirely, a challenge. Because deep down, John knew this wasn't really about the lake or the rules. It was about power. And if Karen thought she could push him around, she was dead wrong. Little did she know, John wasn't the kind of guy to let things slide, not when it came to his home, his freedom, or his dignity. Something inside him clicked that day, a spark of determination igniting in the pit of his stomach. If Karen wanted to play hardball, then fine. He'd show her exactly what he was made of. The next morning, John woke up with a headache. Not the kind you get from drinking too much coffee or staying out late, it was more like the kind that comes from frustration boiling inside you. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the day before. $1,000 fine for swimming in his own lake? It didn't just feel unfair, it felt personal. And if there was one thing John hated, it was being pushed around. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the crumpled piece of paper Karen had handed him. The fine stared back, mocking him. But instead of letting anger consume him, John decided to channel it into something productive. He wasn't going to let this slide, not without a fight. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, then fine. He'd learn those rules better than she ever could. John fired up his laptop and started digging. First, he pulled up the HOA's website, where they posted all their governing documents. There were pages and pages of legalese rules about fences, landscaping, pet ownership, holiday decorations, and even how loud your lawnmower could be. At first glance, it seemed overwhelming, but John wasn't about to give up. He scrolled through every line, searching for anything related to the lake. Hours passed, and just when he thought he might scream from boredom, he found it. Rule 472b, the exact rule Karen had cited during their encounter. As he read it carefully, a slow smile spread across his face. The rule said recreational use of shared bodies of water required prior written approval from the HOA board. Okay, fair enough. But buried in the fine print was something else. Any fines imposed by the board had to be approved unanimously during an official meeting. That meant Karen couldn't just hand out penalties whenever she felt like it. There had to be a vote and everyone on the board had to agree. John leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Had there been a meeting? Had anyone voted on his supposed infraction? He highly doubted it. Karen didn't strike him as someone who played by the book unless it suited her purposes. More likely, she'd made up the whole thing on the spot, hoping he'd pay the fine without asking questions. Well, she'd underestimated him. But John didn't stop there. Once he realized the HOA's rules weren't as ironclad as Karen liked to pretend, he kept digging. He spent hours poring over state laws and local ordinances, determined to find anything that might strengthen his case. Finally, he hit gold again. According to state property law, while the HOA technically owned part of the lake bed, shoreline rights belonged to individual homeowners. In other words, the stretch of land and water right behind John's house was technically his. Sure, the HOA could regulate some things, but they couldn't outright ban him from using the lake. By the time John closed his laptop, he felt like a different person. Gone was the frustration and helplessness from the day before. In its place was a quiet confidence. He had facts, evidence, and legal backing. Now, all he needed was a plan. The following week, John attended the monthly HOA meeting. These gatherings were usually dull affairs, with board members droning on about budget reports and landscaping schedules. Most residents avoided them unless absolutely necessary, but tonight, the room buzzed with curiosity. Word had gotten around about John's run-in with Karen, and people were eager to see how it would play out. When it was finally his turn to speak, John stood up and cleared his throat. Everyone turned to look at him, including Karen, who sat stiffly at the head of the table. Her expression was unreadable, but John noticed her grip tighten slightly on her pen. She knew why he was here. "Good evening," John began, keeping his tone calm and polite. "I'm here because I recently received a fine from the HOA for swimming in the lake behind my house. I want to address this issue tonight." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors exchanged glances, unsure whether to side with John or stay neutral. Karen, meanwhile, cut straight to the chase. "Rule 472B is very clear," she said sharply, not bothering to mask her annoyance. "Recreational use of shared waters requires prior approval. You broke the rules, plain and simple." John nodded, pretending to consider her words. "You're right," he said slowly. "The rule does exist. But according to the HOA's own bylaws, any fines must be approved unanimously during an official meeting. Was there a meeting to discuss my situation? Did the board vote on this?" The room fell silent. All eyes shifted to Karen, who suddenly looked uncomfortable. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. After a long pause, she stammered, "Well, sometimes we handle minor infractions directly to save time." John raised an eyebrow. "So you admit you didn't follow protocol?" Karen's face flushed red. "That's beside the point," she snapped. "The fact remains that you violated the rules." "I understand that," John replied smoothly. "But since the fine wasn't properly authorized, I don't believe it's valid. Furthermore, I've done some research into state property laws. Shoreline rights belong to individual homeowners, which means I have every right to use the lake adjacent to my property as long as I'm not causing harm or disruption." Now the murmurs grew louder. People whispered among themselves, impressed by John's preparation and increasingly skeptical of Karen's authority. Even a few board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they might have backed the wrong horse. Karen, however, refused to back down. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring at John. "If you think you can ignore the rules, you'll regret it." John smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure you'll try something else. But remember this, I know the rules just as well as you do now. And I'm not afraid to stand up for myself or my neighbors if you step out of line again." As the meeting adjourned, John walked out feeling lighter than he had in days. He hadn't won yet, that much was clear, but he'd planted a seed of doubt in the minds of his fellow residents. They were starting to question Karen's methods, and that was exactly what he'd hoped for. Still, John knew Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She'd come after him again, probably harder than before. But now, he was ready. Whatever she threw at him, he'd throw back twice as hard. And deep down, a small part of him actually looked forward to seeing what she'd do next. Over the next few days, John couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was plotting something. He knew her type: stubborn, vindictive, and utterly convinced she was always right. If he thought standing up to her at the HOA meeting would make her back off, he was sorely mistaken. Instead, it seemed to have lit a fire under her. She wasn't about to let him get away with challenging her authority, not in front of everyone. True to form, Karen wasted no time retaliating. A few mornings later, John found a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It was another violation notice, this time for excessive vegetation encroachment. Apparently, the bushes along the side of his house were growing too close to the property line and needed trimming immediately. The penalty? Another $500. John groaned as he read the note. Of course, Karen had timed it perfectly right after their little showdown at the meeting. But instead of getting angry, he chuckled to himself. This was exactly what he'd expected. Karen wasn't just trying to punish him, she was testing him, seeing how far she could push before he cracked. What she didn't realize was that every move she made only fueled his determination to fight back smarter. That's when an idea began to form in John's mind, an idea so bold, so audacious, that it might actually work. He wasn't just going to defend himself anymore. No, this time, he was going to strike first. And he was going to hit Karen where it hurt most, her wallet. The following week, John submitted a proposal to the HOA board. It was titled Enhanced Security Measures for Community Safety, and it sounded harmless enough, at least on the surface. The plan called for increased patrols around the neighborhood, especially near the lake, along with installing high-definition security cameras at key locations. According to John, these measures would deter trespassers, prevent vandalism, and ensure everyone felt safer in their homes. At first glance, it seemed like a reasonable suggestion. After all, who wouldn't want better security? But John had carefully designed the proposal to include one crucial detail: a tiered fee structure based on proximity to the lake. Homes closer to the waterfront would pay significantly higher fees to cover the cost of additional surveillance and patrols. Conveniently, Karen's house fell squarely into the top tier. When the proposal landed on the agenda for the next HOA meeting, John braced himself for Karen's reaction. Sure enough, she showed up armed with objections, but not the ones he anticipated. Rather than opposing the idea outright, Karen surprised everyone by fully supporting it. "I think this is a fantastic initiative," she announced during the meeting, her tone dripping with enthusiasm. "Safety is paramount, and we need to protect our community from outside threats." John almost laughed out loud. Leave it to Karen to embrace anything that gave her more control over the neighborhood. She probably imagined herself as the queen of some gated fortress, patrolling the streets and scolding anyone who stepped out of line. Little did she know, she was walking straight into his trap. As the discussion continued, other board members voiced their opinions. Some were hesitant, worried about the added costs. Others shrugged it off, figuring the expense wouldn't be too bad. After all, how much could a few cameras and extra patrols really cost? That's when John dropped the bombshell. He pulled out a detailed breakdown of the projected expenses, complete with charts and graphs. According to his calculations, implementing the enhanced security measures would increase annual HOA fees by roughly $2,000 per household in the top tier. For Karen, whose house sat practically on the water's edge, that number jumped to a staggering $5,000. The room erupted in murmurs. Neighbors exchanged shocked looks, while a few muttered under their breath about whether the upgrade was really worth it. Karen, meanwhile, stared at the numbers in disbelief. Her face turned pale, then red, then purple, all within seconds. Clearly, she hadn't seen this coming. This can't be right," she stammered, flipping through the pages of John's report. "These numbers are outrageous." "They're accurate," John replied calmly, leaning back in his chair. "I consulted with several professional security firms to get realistic estimates. If you'd like, I can provide references." Karen glared at him, suspicion flashing in her eyes. She must have realized by now that this wasn't just coincidence, it was personal. But there was nothing she could do. The proposal had been presented fairly, and the numbers checked out. When it came time to vote, even Karen begrudgingly raised her hand in favor of the motion, knowing full well that opposing it would raise suspicions among her fellow board members. As the treasurer announced the updated billing schedule, John watched Karen's expression crumble. For once, she was speechless, a rare sight indeed. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, with neighbors whispering about the unexpected twist and casting sideways glances at Karen. By the time it ended, John could barely contain his grin. Later that evening, as John sat on his porch sipping a cold beer, he reflected on what had just happened. Part of him felt guilty for targeting Karen so directly. After all, they lived in the same neighborhood, and escalating things further wouldn't exactly foster harmony. But another part of him felt justified. Karen had brought this on herself with her constant meddling and sense of entitlement. If she wanted to play dirty, fine. He'd show her exactly how messy things could get. Word spread quickly through the community about John's clever maneuver. Some residents cheered him on, tired of Karen's tyrannical behavior. Others kept quiet, unsure whether to take sides. Either way, Karen became the talk of the town, and not in a good way. People joked about her skyrocketing HOA fees, speculating about how she'd managed to pay them without dipping into her retirement fund. For her part, Karen tried to downplay the situation, insisting that the increased fees were necessary for everyone's safety. But deep down, John knew she was fuming. Every time she looked at her bank account or wrote a check to the HOA, she'd remember exactly who was responsible. And if there was one thing John had learned over the past few weeks, it was that revenge, even the subtle, legal kind, could be sweet. The fallout from John's security proposal hit the neighborhood like a storm. At first, it was subtle, a few whispers here and there, some nervous laughter at the grocery store, and an awkward silence whenever Karen walked into a room. But as the reality of the new HOA fees sank in, the tension grew thicker than summer humidity. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen out of fear or politeness now openly questioned her motives and her sanity. Karen, for her part, didn't take it well. She tried to downplay the situation, insisting that the increased fees were a small price to pay for everyone's safety. But no one bought it. Her sudden enthusiasm for security measures felt hollow, especially since she'd been the one to champion them so aggressively during the meeting. People started connecting the dots. This wasn't about protecting the community, it was about control. And when you played games with someone like John, sometimes you lost big. For John, life became a strange mix of satisfaction and vigilance. On one hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph every time he saw Karen squirm. Whether it was her forced smile at the mailbox or the way she avoided eye contact during neighborhood gatherings, it was clear she was feeling the pressure. On the other hand, John knew better than to let his guard down. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, not without a fight. True to form, she came after him with everything she had. Over the next few weeks, John received a flurry of violation notices, each more absurd than the last. One day, it was for having improperly aligned garden gnomes. Apparently, they needed to face the street. Another day, it was for leaving his recycling bin out past 8 a.m. Then there was the infamous mailbox alignment infraction, which claimed his mailbox leaned slightly to the left instead of standing perfectly upright. At first, John found these complaints almost comical. Who cared if his mailbox tilted a fraction of an inch? Or if his gnomes preferred to gaze at the sunset rather than the road? But as the pile of notices grew, he realized Karen wasn't just trying to annoy him, she was trying to bury him under paperwork. Every complaint came with a fine, and while none of them were huge individually, they added up quickly. But John refused to buckle. Each time a new notice arrived, he responded with calm precision. He sent emails to the HOA board, attaching photos, measurements, and even expert opinions to prove Karen's accusations were baseless. For example, when she accused him of improper mailbox alignment, he hired a surveyor to confirm it was within acceptable limits. When she claimed his gnomes violated aesthetic guidelines, he pointed out that the HOA handbook didn't mention garden decor at all. Slowly but surely, John dismantled each of Karen's attacks. Every time she threw something at him, he countered with facts and evidence. It was exhausting, sure, but also strangely satisfying. Watching Karen's carefully constructed arguments crumble under scrutiny gave him a quiet thrill. More importantly, it sent a message to the rest of the neighborhood: Karen wasn't untouchable. As word spread about John's victories, the dynamics of the community began to shift. Some neighbors started speaking up more openly against Karen's heavy-handed tactics. A few even admitted they'd been too intimidated to challenge her before but now felt emboldened by John's example. Others still kept their distance, unsure whether to side with him or stay neutral. But one thing was certain: Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Desperate to regain control, Karen decided to escalate things further. She called an emergency HOA meeting, claiming it was urgent. When John arrived, he found her pacing nervously near the front of the room, clutching a stack of papers like they were lifelines. As the meeting began, she launched into a tirade, accusing John of being disruptive and divisive. "This man is deliberately undermining our community," she declared, pointing a finger at him. "He's stirring up trouble, ignoring rules, and refusing to cooperate. If we don't act now, he'll destroy everything we've worked so hard to build." John listened patiently, letting her rant herself out. When she finally paused for breath, he stood up and addressed the group. "I understand why some of you might be concerned," he said calmly. "But I want to clarify something. I'm not trying to cause problems, I'm trying to protect my rights as a homeowner. Every action I've taken has been based on the HOA's own rules and state laws. If anyone here disagrees with me, I'd be happy to discuss it." His response deflated Karen's argument instantly. No one could deny that John had followed proper procedures, whereas Karen's accusations sounded increasingly hollow. Even some of her closest allies on the board seemed uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in their seats as she continued to rant. After the meeting, Karen cornered John outside. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her clipboard. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she hissed, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Well, this isn't over. Mark my words, I'll find a way to make you regret this." John met her gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "I don't doubt that you'll try," he replied. "But remember this, every step you take against me, I'll match it. And trust me, I've got plenty of ideas left." Karen glared at him for a moment longer before storming off, muttering under her breath. John watched her go, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew she wouldn't give up easily, but neither would he. Over time, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. While tensions lingered, they weren't as suffocating as before. People started hosting backyard barbecues again, chatting freely without worrying about Karen lurking nearby. Kids played outside without fear of being scolded for riding their bikes too fast. Slowly but surely, the community began to breathe easier. For John, the ordeal had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He'd always considered himself a laid-back guy, content to live quietly and avoid drama. But standing up to Karen had taught him the value of fighting for what mattered, not just for himself, but for others too. Seeing his neighbors gain confidence and push back against unreasonable rules made him realize how much power people had when they worked together. Still, John knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Karen was still out there, plotting her next move. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Sitting on his dock as the sun dipped below the horizon, he reflected on everything that had happened. Life was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been, and that was enough. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to feel different, lighter, somehow. The air no longer carried the weight of Karen's constant hovering or her clipboard-wielding presence at every turn. Instead, there was a sense of calm, like the community had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. People started talking to each other more, sharing smiles instead of wary glances. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to retreat into the background. She still attended HOA meetings, though less frequently, and when she did, her contributions were quieter, almost hesitant. Gone was the fiery rhetoric and the sharp accusations that used to dominate discussions. Now, she mostly nodded along, scribbling notes in the margins of her agenda without saying much. Some neighbors speculated that the financial strain of her inflated HOA fees had finally caught up with her. Others thought she might have realized her tactics weren't working anymore, or worse, that she'd lost face entirely. Whatever the reason, Karen kept to herself, avoiding confrontation and blending into the crowd. For John, life returned to something resembling normalcy. He still kept an eye out for any new violations or surprise notices, but they never came. Whether Karen had given up or simply run out of ammunition, he didn't know, and honestly, he didn't care. What mattered was that he'd reclaimed his peace. The lake behind his house once again became his sanctuary, a place where he could swim, fish, or just sit and watch the ripples dance across the surface. But the experience had left its mark. John found himself looking at the world differently now. Before, he'd seen rules as guidelines meant to keep things orderly. Now, he understood how easily they could be twisted by people who craved control. He also realized the importance of standing up for yourself, not just for your own sake, but for others too. His actions had inspired some of his neighbors to push back against unreasonable regulations, sparking small but meaningful changes within the community. One evening, as autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and crimson, John hosted a small gathering at his house. A few neighbors brought snacks, another brought a guitar, and soon the backyard was filled with laughter and music. Someone even joked about starting a John Anderson Appreciation Club, which earned a round of applause and a lot of teasing. As the night wore on, one of the older residents raised a glass and said, "To John for showing us we don't have to settle for nonsense." The comment drew cheers, but John shook his head modestly. "I didn't do anything special," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We all stood up together. That's what made the difference." It was true, to an extent. While John had been the catalyst, others had joined him in subtle ways by questioning Karen's decisions, supporting his proposals, or simply refusing to stay silent. Together, they'd created a shift in the balance of power, proving that even the most stubborn personalities could be challenged if enough people worked together. Still, not everything changed overnight. The HOA still existed, and so did its rules, some of which remained frustratingly nitpicky. But the atmosphere was different. Board meetings became shorter and less combative, focusing on practical matters rather than personal vendettas. New initiatives, like park cleanup days and holiday potlucks, brought people closer together. Even Karen softened slightly, though she never fully apologized for her past behavior. One day, she even complimented John's garden, calling it neatly maintained. He accepted the olive branch with a polite nod, knowing better than to expect miracles. As winter approached, John spent more time indoors, reading by the fire or tinkering with projects around the house. Occasionally, he'd think back to those tense summer months, the confrontations, the late-night research sessions, the endless battle of wills. It felt almost surreal now, like something out of a movie. He wondered if Karen ever thought about it too, sitting alone in her oversized living room, staring at the stack of unpaid bills piling up on her desk. Then again, maybe she didn't. Maybe she'd convinced herself that none of it mattered, that she'd done nothing wrong and everyone else was overreacting. If so, John didn't waste energy dwelling on it. Life was too short to hold grudges, especially over something as trivial as HOA disputes. Besides, he had bigger things to focus on, like enjoying the quiet moments he'd fought so hard to preserve. One crisp December morning, as snow dusted the ground and the lake froze over, John bundled up and took a walk along the shoreline. The world felt hushed, wrapped in a blanket of white. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly content. The battles were behind him, and the future stretched ahead, full of possibilities. He stopped near the water's edge, breathing in the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and children laughed as they built a snowman. John smiled to himself, thinking about how far they'd come. Sure, the neighborhood wasn't perfect, it probably never would be. But it was better than before. And sometimes, that was enough. Turning back toward his house, John felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the home he loved, but for the lessons he'd learned along the way. Standing up to Karen hadn't been easy, but it had taught him something invaluable: the power of persistence, the strength of community, and the courage to fight for what you believe in. As he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, John knew one thing for sure: whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready. After all, if he could take on the HOA Karen, he could handle just about anything.